So it's never a good sign if MCC Feszt starts with geopolitics. I guess the sky is blue over us, but in terms of geopolitics, the sky is unfortunately gray and stormy. So the panel was already introduced, but let me repeat the introduction. Let me start with Gladden Papen, first from the right. Gladden. David Karalekas. And, I have to say that all of them are authors of several books and articles, and also contributors to papers like Times, like New York Times, Los Angeles Times, etc. I'm not going to repeat it with all of them. Benjamin Friedman. And last but not least, Mick Hume. So, just like last year, we start with geopolitics and geopolitical realities. And I think this panel is absolutely destined to tell you the truth without any political correctness. And I would like to encourage everybody to be very straightforward, no subjects should be left outside because of any concerns. This is the place where we can speak freely. One of the few places I can say in the West where there are no secret cows. So I think this is going to be a very good discussion, and let's not waste any more time. Let's start with the first question, which is how the war changed the geopolitical realities in the world. How do you see that? Maybe we could start with Gladden.
Thank you, Attila, particularly for starting with such an easy question. I mean, how has the war changed geopolitical realities? Well, people are fond of talking about periods of major geopolitical change, and it's clear somehow that we're entering one, and we can talk more about what exactly that means. But I wanted to focus on what we've seen about the role of the United States in the last year and a half. And it seems pretty clear to me that the United States is exercising a huge amount of power, maybe more power than it has at any point in the last 20 years, even though people are beginning to talk about the decline or the end of the unipolar moment. So how can both of these things be true? How can the US be exercising a huge amount of power, but also somehow losing power in the world at large? And it seems to me that the US is exercising a huge amount of power. It's pretty much determined the war policy. It is by far the primary supplier of material, supplier of wartime decision-making, intelligence, economic aid, everything. I mean, if you compare the US, the European Union, individual countries, other sources of support in the war, the US outshines them all. The strange thing is that all of this has happened basically without any debate about the war in the United States. The support has been given in small aid packages, large by any standard, but small by the standards of American budgeting. And somehow this vacuum of political debate that has been around the US support for the war effort means that the US has been exercising a huge amount of power without having to exercise leadership. If we ask the question, what is going to bring the war to an end? Is the US going to propose a negotiated settlement? What is the path to peace? No one knows the answers to those questions, and that's incredibly strange. It's an incredibly strange situation for a global leader to be in. And I think it means that a lot of people are recognizing the same situation, that even though major decisions are made in Washington, the question about NATO expansion is obviously going to be decided in Washington. So many important questions are decided by Washington, including effectively the energy policy of Europe, the sanctions policy. All of these things have Washington as a major mover, and yet there is within the halls of power all over Europe and elsewhere in the world a great uncertainty about where that's going and what it means. And so for me, the last year and a half has been a kind of revelation of this, that, yes, people talk about the US now dominating European policy more than it ever has before, but to what end? Where is it going? What is the point of the leadership? That's what's become unclear, and I think a lot of other countries are looking at it the same way, even if it's unclear how to navigate it.
Dean, what is the view from Canada?
Well, as a good Canadian, we're always living in the shadow of our large American cousins. So every time, whenever America sneezes, Canada gets a cold. Much like the world gets a cold. And you're right, it is very much, it seems to be Washington-centric. There seems to be so much coming out of Washington that's driving the current geopolitical shift, if you will. From the Canadian perspective, sometimes we tend to look at the United States and we say, why do they constantly need to be at war? And maybe some of my American friends could answer that question. Why is there what Tulsi Gabbard called the forever wars? Why do we need forever wars? Is it good for the economy? Is it good because manufacturing keeps moving? For whatever reason. So I think what you have in the situation in Ukraine, kind of in a way, in a very cynical way, and I don't necessarily believe this myself, but I've heard this argument, and it's hard to say there's nothing to it, is that it serves that purpose of being a forever war without the negative visuals of body bags coming home. Because those really are what American people, American voters, don't want to see. And so you have a situation where, arguably, Washington is fighting a proxy war. But they're fighting a proxy war where Russia is not fighting a proxy war, right? For Russia, that's a real war. For the Ukrainians, obviously, it's a real war. But Western support for Ukraine is sort of, it's treating it like it's a proxy war. As for the geopolitical shift, I mean, we're living in a very interesting time. May you live in interesting times is the curse. And we're living in interesting times, and we're living in this liminal time, this between what was and between what will be. And these shifts, these geopolitical shifts, take decades. So, I mean, in the long run, and I tend to like to speculate on the long run because I'll be long dead before I'm proven wrong, is that what is the world going to look like in the long run when we come through this shift that we're living through now? I mean, it's so impossible to say. If you look at the last shift, which ended in the Cold War scenario, which at the end of World War II, and it was, the world had become basically bipolar. And how different is that? Think about how different that is, not to be before World War II, but before World War I. Because arguably you can conceptualize World War II as an extension of World War I. So before World War I, you had a geopolitical situation marked by empire. So you had the British Empire, the sun still never set on it. You had the Habsburgs, you had the Ottomans, and then boom, a few decades later, end of World War II, completely new situation, and completely new from really since before the Romans. It's always been the empire to build. So now we've done away with that thinking. So what is it going to look like? It's as impossible to say with any certainty, I think, exactly what it's going to look like. So maybe you know.
Yeah, I don't know. Let me make a couple points. Number one, I agree. The unipolar moment, its demise, its death was overrated. And I think if you look across sort of indices of power, the United States remains a behemoth, and this war is demonstrating that. And in the brains of the people in Washington, D.C., the people in power, I live there, the war is kind of created a sense of revitalization of the sort of American global project after a lot of unhappy experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth. And I think it's probably creating something we in America are prone to, which is extreme overconfidence in our own abilities to shape global events. That's one. Two, I think there was an initial geopolitical reaction to the war that has actually kind of gone away, and what the war has actually shown is the stability of international politics. So let me briefly explain that. The initial reaction to the Russian invasion, sort of like their seizure of Crimea in 2014, was but to a greater extent, was to create what we in international relations feel called balancing. So energized efforts around here, and particularly in the Baltics, in Germany, most importantly, to spend more money on defense and to some extent to do more European defense, to work more to balance the Russian threat through more arms and greater European defense cooperation. And that's unsurprising. People see a big invasion of a nearby state, they tend to balance threats. But I think that actually is not the most important thing to take away from the war, because as the war has continued, two things have happened. One, the United States has sort of asserted itself, as I said, not just by giving Ukraine the bulk of the money it needs to prosecute its side of the war, but by sending 20,000 additional US forces to Europe. So I think if you look at what happened in Berlin and other parts of the more central or Western Europe, their kind of initial eagerness to sort of step up and say, okay, we're gonna do more, has gone away because Russia has bogged down and because the United States has done more. So the balancing has kind of occurred at a far lesser clip than you might have imagined a year and a half ago. And in the meantime, I think the Russian failure, maybe things will change, but Russia's failure to achieve their objectives in Ukraine, their surprising success of the Ukrainian military has underlined the advantages of defensive warfare. And we could get into sort of the technology of that, but I think there are good reasons why it is hard to invade a country for military technological reasons these days, and because of the sort of strategy of defense, the politics of defense, the fact that you get a lot of outside support, that Russia got sanctioned so heavily, and that they've increased the thing they were allegedly angry at, which is Ukrainian nationalism. So I think in a way, what Russia has done is show everyone, including China, the difficulties of invading a neighbor. And it's in a way underlining why this sort of thing is so rare in modern politics, why interstate warfare has become increasingly rare. So in a way, there's a happy story there amid all the tragedy and suffering in Ukraine, which is that the world is pretty stable. It's hard to just take over other countries, let alone recreate empires. There's certainly a big lesson there for the United States. If we didn't learn it in Iraq and other places, we're not as weak as Russia. But it's good news for most of Europe that Russia is not the big behemoth that many people thought it was. It's far weaker. And that means, I think, as an American, we don't need to do so much in Europe. And probably the Europeans are in a safer place than at least everybody writing articles in foreign affairs and places like that would have said a year ago.
So Mick, what's the view from London?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for getting my name right. Only my mother and the Metropolitan Police in London call me Michael. Secondly, just to say I don't speak for London or the UK, as the UK government will be very quick to point out to you. Just to point a couple of these things in a slightly broader context. I'm not sure if the war is the cause of these things or a catalyst that's brought things to the surface. But either way, I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war has really brought geopolitics colliding with reality. It's kind of exposed some of the myths of geopolitical conversation over the last 30 years. In some ways, it's forced us to kind of cut the crap, if you like, if I may use that phrase, about geopolitics. You remember the last 30-odd years, we've been told often that about the end of history, everything is settled. There will be no major conflicts again in the world. We've been told we live in a globalized world where borders don't matter, where national sovereignty is unimportant, where you can depend for your manufacturing industry on China, where you can run a pipeline and depend on for your energy needs on a foreign power. And it doesn't matter because we're all in it together under a globalized world. And I think the geopolitical realities that have been exposed by the war in Ukraine include the fact that borders really do matter, that national sovereignty is a crucial issue that people are prepared to fight and die for, and also one which spins over into all kinds of European politics about migration and everything else that we're very aware of here in Hungary, and that we don't live in this perfect globalized world. and that alongside the reassertion of American power, we see new regional blocs appearing in the world, which have potential to destabilize things very seriously. I was very interested in if you cast your mind back to that first United Nations emergency vote on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where it was a condemnation of Russia and a demand for immediate withdrawal. Only about 5 of the usual suspects voted against, Russia's usual friends. 150 nations voted, or 150 I think, voted in favor of it. But 35, I think, nations abstained on that vote, on a very clear-cut vote of whether you were for or against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They included China and India, which account for what, maybe a quarter of the world's population, a swathe of countries across Africa, including South Africa, which once had been the most westernized nation thought of as that, in that continent, countries in Asia, 4 or 5 countries in Latin America. So that's a different situation in the world that we're having to deal with, that's come to the surface through the reaction to the war. So I think, the lesson is that history is still in play and up for grabs, and we should be very careful of where we go next.
One question to our American guests. Benjamin, you talked about the confidence of America, and it was shattered by the failure in Iraq, the failure in Afghanistan, and somehow it's back, because many sees it, and I think it's up to a degree, or to a very large degree, true that the Ukraine could defend itself so successfully, mainly because of American help. But what happens to this confidence if the war ends not the way it was predicted by the New York Times just 6 months ago, but the way it is predicted more like Mark Milley and the realists like Professor Mearsheimer? What will happen to this confidence? So Benjamin, can you reflect on that?
Well, I think that confidence is easier to build or rebuild than to break down. So I am a big believer in my country's ability to declare victory, even in circumstances where it's inappropriate. So I'm not sure if the confidence will be ruined. What I would say is I think that the sort of Russian success that they set out for, at the Kremlin set out for at the start of the war, was the war plan that Putin had was so absurd. Invading a country of 44 million people with 100,000 and thinking you're going to change the regime, that it was sort of bound for failure, and it's sort of a testament to, I guess, why autocratic rule creates bad information for rulers. A horrendous decision. And so in that sense, I think that, if we in the United States are looking to, say, defend the idea of sovereignty, the idea, that is, that you shouldn't invade other countries and try to forcefully change borders, never mind the fact that we might be accused of hypocrisy on that front. But that's often given as the reason. If that's the goal, we can have a parade, because Russia has put out basically a global public service warning, as I said, about the difficulties of this kind of thing. So therefore, I think it's unlikely that we'll get to the point in the United States where we say, wow, we really failed. And that's good in a way, but it's also bad because I think there's a lot of failure that the United States could be accused of, particularly in the run-up to the war, where I think our insistence on offering Ukraine not a real chance at a security guarantee, because I don't believe it's likely that the United States will ever directly defend Ukraine, whether or not we put them in NATO, which I don't think we will. But even if we do, we're showing that we're not going to risk a nuclear war for you. So, and yet we pursued a policy before the war, which was, no, don't worry, you guys can join eventually. And the George W. Bush administration were heavily responsible for that. But so that policy was disastrous, I think, for Ukraine, because we said on the one hand, we'll probably defend you. So that gave them confidence maybe to be somewhat uncompromising. But it was fake. It wasn't a real promise, as they found out. And now it's still a fake promise. And I think we're in danger of making the same mistake of leading them, as Mearsheimer, who you mentioned, said, down the primrose path, saying, oh yeah, we're going to help you, don't worry. And we'll give them arms until the cows come home, that's clear. But fight for them, I don't think they should ever count on that. But we keep telling them we might. So I think that's deeply irresponsible and something that a lot of people should feel bad about. but probably won't.
Well, Glenn, one moment. It happened to us. Maybe you don't know, but in '56, my grandfather always told me that he was listening to the radio, and the Americans were closer and closer to Hungary to save us, and then nothing happened. So maybe it's better to say directly that will we help or not. And I think in the case when the other side has 6,000 nukes, that's a tricky thing. But Glenn, you have something to add?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with what you said there at the end about this typical path that American foreign policy takes, but I think we shouldn't describe that as being a situation of confidence now in the United States. I think it's more like the US is running on autopilot with the same foreign policy tools that it created in the 1990s, not realizing that the results of pressing the same buttons are now different from what they were when dealing with small powers or small situations in the 1990s. The other element that I would add in is that because the United States hasn't committed troops, it's really not comparable to the Iraq War or the Afghan conflict in terms of analyzing American confidence. If we were to put the question of committing American troops, or if there were to be the American blood shed on national, seeing it on national TV every day, I think the support of the American people for the war there would be none whatsoever. And I think it's a question actually when it comes to Taiwan as well. I mean, the only experiences that America has had with war in the last 20 years have been failures of one sort or another. Trump was brought to power in 2016 in part by Republican dissatisfaction with this. So part of the ability of the United States to pursue this policy over the last year and a half has been its ability to do so kind of under the table, like one bill here, one bill there, one bill there, one bill there. But I remember going back to the US in the middle of winter and people who were like very plugged into finance and law, like smart professional people were asking me, is Europe freezing this winter? Is there like an energy problem or a gas problem? Somehow the whole situation is surreal. The policymakers, they're still the people who they designed the policies or the policy tools in the 1990s. They're still in power, but there has been a loss of confidence among ordinary people in America's ability to succeed in major military operations. And it's kind of mind-boggling to me that after struggling in Iraq and struggling in Afghanistan for 20 years, people will then conclude, oh, well, yeah, America will have no problem going to war with China. So it's a really strange situation.
Yeah, I would just say I agree with that. And I should have said I really, when I say this sort of idea that unipolarity is back, we're really talking about, I am at least the elite, the blob, if you will, and the American people are sort of another matter. But I would just, to your point, I mean, we spent, I think, north of $130 billion allocated on Ukraine, and it's true, I agree. Congress has barely debated that, hardly at all. And it's just something that we could write $130 billion worth of checks without really having a conversation about it, or really being that, I mean, you hear a bit of controversy, but about it, it's not very controversial. So, I mean, that's a kind of power. It's a kind of irresponsible, wild power, but it's still there for sure.
Mick, do you?
Yeah, just one quick point. I really agree with this point about NATO's policy towards Ukraine. I think NATO has been nothing but bad news for Ukraine. They've dangled, under American leadership, they've dangled this carrot of membership of NATO, membership of the EU, membership of the Western community, and given this kind of false hope of incorporation to the Ukrainians. I don't think they're ever going to let Ukraine into NATO. They don't want a war with Russia over a border in Ukraine. And I think NATO's whole policy has, I don't think for a moment that NATO's to blame for Russia invading Ukraine. I don't go down that road. I think Russia is to blame for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But NATO has created a situation where that was possible for it to happen. They have their completely cack-handed handling of Russia and the Eastern European situation. Why does NATO even exist? NATO is a Cold War organization, and after they won the Cold War, albeit by default, some might say, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, surely NATO had done its job, and yet we had a NATO expansion as a kind of proof of American and Western leadership, which was only going to lead to more conflict and increasing tensions. So I think NATO has been nothing but bad news for Ukraine, although I would not blame NATO for Putin's invasion.
Can I say something quickly about blame? I'll try to be very fast. One, there's different kinds of blame. So, if somebody burglarizes your house, if they break into your house and steal your stuff, they're the criminal, and they're responsible for that, morally, legally. The invasion of Ukraine was illegal. That doesn't matter that much in international law, but I'd say it was immoral. Russia's responsible. It's their fault. They should suffer the consequences. But if somebody breaks into your house because you left the keys sitting on the porch or the window open and went on vacation and failed to pay attention to what was happening, you have a kind of responsibility. You were foolish. You were reckless. So that's the kind of responsibility I would assign to policymakers in Washington and Brussels. They didn't invade Ukraine. They're not responsible in that sense, but they were reckless, and they deserve to be blamed in that sense.
Dean, anything to add from your part?
Oh, maybe just briefly a couple of Canadian observations, eh? So I agree that messaging was just terrible, and so all the talk about bringing Ukraine into NATO when it really wasn't necessary, I think we all knew that that would nudge Putin, and probably in the wrong direction, and it was probably irresponsible. And it reminds me a little bit of Gulf War I, when essentially the American ambassador in Baghdad could perceptibly have given the green light to Saddam Hussein to take over Kuwait. That was the impression that he took away from that meeting. And so it was a clear problem with messaging. The messaging wasn't focused, it wasn't well considered, and I think there's the problem. And what we're seeing, we're learning a lot from the Ukraine war. We're learning a lot how war is and will be fought as we move forward in the 21st century. We're learning the importance of narrative. I think in today's globalized and computerized and cell phoneized, is that a word? I just made it up, world, that it's all about communications and it's all about narrative. And so each side is trying to control the narrative. So Putin tried to control the narrative. Look, we're denazifying Ukraine. Nazis, you all hate them. We all hate them, right? We're going to go in there and root out the Nazis, so you should be behind us, right? That's a clumsy narrative. Whereas the Ukrainians had a much better narrative. Once the fighting started, they had the ghost of Kiev flying through the skies and shooting down all the Russian jets. And they had little old ladies handing sunflower seeds to the Russian soldiers. Put these in your pocket so when you die, at least sunflowers will grow here. These are powerful narratives, the images as well as the stories. And so when the outside world sees this, the outside world says, yes, we will support you. And it's all based on who has the better narrative. So messaging is hugely important, I guess, is the bullet point I'm trying to convey here. Thank you.
Dean, let's stay with you. We have another big country already mentioned, China. How do you see it? How all the panelists see China's role in the conflict and China's, let's say, intentions towards Taiwan? Is China a problem? Of course, I think for the Americans it is. But could we see a Canadian view first?
Well, Canadians really love China, especially our government. Our current government my Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, I think his word was, I admire China's basic dictatorship. So we are, maybe we differ from the Americans on that. But I tend to see, so I like to look at the culture. What does the culture tell me? Because culture leads politics, and culture ultimately drives policy because it's so powerful and it's distinctive of the place and the people whom it represents. So what do we see? I think in the East in general, in the Far East in general, but in China in specific, you see, and this comes back to the issue of confidence we talked about, we see a civilizational confidence. And so if we're looking forward to the next 100 years, next 200 years, this civilizational confidence is something that Europe once had, that America, until recently, I would argue, still had. Recently, I think there's a little bit of navel gazing where I say we in the West, in the Anglosphere, in Western Europe, and the Americas, we're a little too worried about pronouns than we are about geopolitical shifts. And that's just navel gazing. That's useless. And that's what consumes us now. So I think we've lost that, the West has lost that civilizational confidence. That's so, it's not something you can measure, really. It's something that's a little bit ephemeral, and but it's so increasingly important in, driving forward your population as a group, as a unit, to achieve great things. And I think the Chinese are expecting to achieve great things. Remember, they have a different perspective on history than we in the West grew up with, this idea that history is a linear progression, and we build upon, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we build upon our past successes, and we create new successes, and we pass that on to our descendants, who will carry the torch and move forward in this straight line. In the East, they tend to see it as circular. History is circular. And so things that happened in the past will happen again, especially if you look at the Chinese dynasties. When the dynasty becomes corrupt, it becomes weak, they lose the mandate of heaven, and then they become easy prey for a strong, civilizationally confident faction or kingdom who takes the throne. And then they go through that same procession, maybe 200 or 300 years this circle lasts. And so I think the Chinese see that America's had its 200 or 300 years as the unipolar power, the global hegemon, and maybe it's time for them to take over. Now, I'm not saying I agree with one or the other. I'm just saying that if you have two arguably opposing ideologies, and they look at their own manifest destiny in two completely different ways, then that could be the recipe for some disaster there, because we're not on the same page, we're not on the same wavelength. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think it's very striking that the Chinese obviously have always taken the long view. I agree with that, of these matters. I always remember the Chinese communist leader Chou Enlai, on the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, was asked what he thought the consequences of the French Revolution had been, and he said it's too soon to say, which is a kind of very Chinese view of history and seeing things in the long term. If we can say that neither Russia nor Ukraine has won the war, I think the two main beneficiaries internationally so far, it seems to me, have been the United States, in terms of the reassertion of its leadership role in the West, albeit problematic, that we've talked about, and China, which has emerged on the world stage as a player in a more upfront kind of way. And I think it's a very difficult relationship for both sides to manage. I still think that America is obviously what we might call a status quo power, in as much as it would like international relations to have been frozen about 1945 or maybe about 1990, so that it has, things are as they are and American leadership is unquestioned. I think that China is still has been also a status quo power, not actually wanting to turn the world upside down, as long as it was doing so well economically. But as the economic tensions come to the surface, different factors come to play, and China definitely has its regional ambitions in the Pacific. It's very busy in Africa and other parts of Asia, building new alliances. So it's a very difficult relationship for both sides to manage over something like Taiwan. I'm glad I'm not the person who has to make those decisions. I would say, however, that it's not helped by the fact that there's American diplomacy, in inverted commas, seems to have lost any sense of how to diplomatically deal with these kind of problems. When you have a leading American politician flying into Taiwan to make a political statement, basically as an electoral stunt to help her in her domestic elections, that is no way to manage global relations between two kind of tense and competing superpowers. I think that's only going to make things worse.
I guess I'll make 3 points. One, I'm going to disagree with you a little, Dean. One, it's not narrative, it's reality. So the Ukrainians are more motivated in fighting than the Russians because they were invaded. They're not invading, and not always, but it tends to be more motivating to have your own territory invaded, regardless of how well you craft a story. And they receive sympathy from the world because they were invaded. And this is relevant to China because in the event they went for Taiwan, they view it as their territory, but I don't think the rest of the world would look at it that way. I think a lot of Taiwanese wouldn't. So they might face similar problems in that realm. The other thing is, I don't think it's civilizational confidence, it's wealth creation. You know, when your GDP is headed to 20 trillion or something like that, you know, you can be kind of weak and at least not that confident and still be generating a lot of influence and power around the world. So, you know, a lot of countries are confident. I'm quite confident playing basketball sometimes, but I'm not going to play in the NBA. So, you know, capabilities has a lot to do with it. Then finally, I think there's a lot to say about China and the United States, but I'll start with this. 95% of the problem between China and the United States is Taiwan. I think there's way too much talk about how far is China going to go. They're going to come for the United States' pole position as the #1 state in the world. I don't see a lot of evidence that the Chinese are embarking on some quest to create an empire in Asia, nor do I think it's very possible, because the defensive problems that the problems Russia has invading Ukraine would be far worse for China if they tried to invade anything beyond Taiwan. That would be tough, but if they think about going to Japan or somewhere over a lot of water, they're going to run into all kinds of problems. They're not ready for an empire. Asia, as a scholar said, has a geography of peace. So there's not that much. The sources of tension in the United States' relationship with China, I would say, are about 90% Taiwan, with some stuff about human rights, and maybe Japan bringing up the rest of the 10%. But it's really Taiwan, 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 in my view.
Just one remark. Taiwan is, of course, called the Republic of China, while China is called the People's Republic of China. So in terms of, let's say, international law, that's a bit different situation. But of course, I agree with you that if there would be a Chinese invasion, many would see it as a illegal invasion. But in terms of legality, that's very different from what the Russians did in the Ukraine. But Gladden, do you have anything to add?
I think America is going to have a very difficult time coming up with a coherent approach to China. Like the conditions within which America could make a good decision about what it should do are not there. And the reason for that, I think, is that China really re-entered the American political discourse because of a domestic economic situation, not because of Taiwan. It's simply become filtered through these other reflexive elements of American policymaking. It re-entered American political consciousness in 2016, and that was because of deindustrialization. So there was this famous map that went around in 2016 called the China Shock Index, showing in shades of from yellow to like bright orange or bright red, places in the United States that had lost industry to China. And America is basically in search of some kind of answer to that. Now, from a Chinese perspective, it's kind of like, hey, you know, you let us into the World Trade Organization and we started playing by the global rules and everyone was in favor of globalization and borders don't matter anymore and it doesn't matter where you build stuff. And so we built stuff and now you're mad, United States. So that's kind of the Chinese perspective. And it seems to me that there are three ways that America is thinking about responding to this situation where it's lost a lot of its manufacturing capacity. It still has an edge in a lot of different high technology fields it's trying to fight over. But the fact of the matter is that the world has become extremely interconnected in terms of its supply chains. We all saw this during COVID. So one impulse that's coming up in American foreign policy is, well, we really economically depend, particularly in our semiconductor industry, on Taiwan. So let's make sure that there's not a war there by massively arming up in the region. So this is basically the new hawk option on China, and that's becoming very strong in the Republican Party because it's more instinctive and easier to deal with than other responses. The other responses are, let's have a trade war with China. That kind of started during the Trump administration. It was one of the policies that the Biden administration has continued. And that's kind of on the rocks because turns out China controls a lot of key minerals that we need. So if we want to have a little bit of a trade war with them, they can have a bit of a trade war with the United States. And the third option, which is the hardest to pursue, is some kind of reindustrialization. That would actually answer the domestic political situation that led to China becoming a topic in the American political imagination, but it's one for which there's the least amount of political capital. The Democrats and the Republicans have traditionally been against industrial policy, so they're very skeptical of this. The Democrats pull everything in like a green energy direction. And just in general, the idea that America could commit itself to like a 20-year reindustrialization process is pretty low considering the political and economic stakes. The only trouble is that both of the other options, war over Taiwan and trade war, both make the American economic situation even worse. So, leading to more social instability, more deindustrialization. America is basically putting Europe through a partial deindustrialization by raising energy prices. So it seems to me that it's very worrisome to me that American planners, if they think that have recovered a unipolar moment, if that's what they're thinking, I think the consequences of that should be very sobering to us because yes, they have become more powerful over a certain area, particularly Europe in the last year and a half, but it's power over something that's weakening. And that's not a situation that points toward peace. So those of us who want a peaceful and interconnected world will have to make the argument in European terms, in Hungarian terms, in American terms, in every set of terms that the options for war, the options for trade war will only lead to more misery.
Well, we have only 20 minutes left, and we have a small topic left for that 1/3 of our time, US elections. What can it bring to the world? Can it bring realism back? Because somehow I feel that we talked about the same thing, that there was too much ideology in Western policies. I felt from some of you that you stated that. So can we go back to realism? Or is it just like a pipe dream? Will we live in this world forever? There is no forever, of course, in history. But still, what the elections can bring? Maybe Benjamin, could you start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I believe, to begin with, that ideology is sort of inescapable. So I think the key is to have a good one. Not to try to rid yourself of it. Liberalism is an ideology that I subscribe to, and I think it would be difficult to navigate politics without it. But we struggle with bad ideologies in U.S. foreign policy, neoconservatism in particular, but liberal internationalism and the tendency to crusade in whatever ism you want to put on that. In the name of democracy or freedom and get into all kinds of trouble, and that's a bad ideology. I don't think you would lose a lot of money if you look back over time betting on the status quo in spite of elections that would seem to be big game changers when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. So, of course, I'm aware that Donald Trump could be president again, and he has a very different view of foreign affairs than Biden, and to a lesser extent and a lesser degree of likelihood, Ron DeSantis or some other Republican could be elected and has some greater skepticism, certainly about U.S. support for Ukraine than is standard in D.C. So in that sense, there could be a big change. That being said, Trump was president for 4 years, and if you look at U.S. policy towards Ukraine in that time, the whole time we were having a scandal about him being in the pocket of Putin, he barely changed U.S. policy towards Ukraine, where there was already a war going on. Remember, the war, in a sense, started in 2014. And except for this incident that got him impeached, where Trump tried to basically use U.S. aid to Ukraine to extort some information, he kept U.S. policy towards Ukraine more or less the way it was. Now, maybe he wanted to change it and couldn't because he felt political pressure from the investigations, or more likely, in my view, he just never had follow through on basically anything, or change his mind 5 times a week. I don't know. So I think it wouldn't surprise me if Trump became president and sort of forgot about his criticism of U.S. policies in Ukraine, or maybe we had some kind of cut in the amount of aid, so we go from $100 billion a year to 80, but things stay essentially the same. And if that seems crazy to you, again, go back and look at the history of U.S. foreign policy, say since the end of the Cold War. presidents come and presidents go, and a lot of fundamental policies stay almost exactly the same, even when the rhetoric would lead you to believe that there's going to be big changes. So there could be big changes, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Gladden?
I more or less agree with the preceding speaker, I think so. I don't know, the American regime is pretty strong, by which I mean the Biden administration is pretty strong. It's hard to believe this from a certain perspective, because when one looks at President Biden and sees the videos of incidents with him, one thinks, wow, what's going on in America? This is a really weak president in some way. But in fact, his strength, or the strength of the administration, comes from the fact that he's not particularly partisan within the Democratic Party. He doesn't represent just one faction. He's actually providing a situation in which all of the elements of the Democratic Party and the regime, if you will, are basically able to function, or at least to be higher than they would otherwise. You know, if, for example, you had a specifically progressive president who was, socially progressive, economically progressive, taking Wall Street and big corporations as an enemy or something, then you've got certain people up, certain people down in the Democratic Party, but in fact, they're all doing pretty well. And secondly, Biden is not hated. He's not a hateable politician. You know, Trump had the advantage of running against Hillary Clinton, whom a lot of people intensely disliked. And although people might make fun of Biden or regret it's in some way a sad situation for a major power that its presidents are not like young and vivacious and like representing a clear vision or something. Nevertheless, it's a situation that favors the continuity of things. And if you look at just to say one brief word about, if there were a Republican victory, you do have some skepticism about the war effort from certain wings of the Republican Party. But for the most part, a lot of Republicans would rather refocus on China. And so you start to hear Republicans saying, well, Europe should contribute more to its own defense. The US has been undertaking a defense of Europe through its support for Ukraine. That has revealed to America a lot of weaknesses in its military supply chain. America has run down a lot of its military supplies, at least the stocks that it's willing to send elsewhere. And this is a situation which is sobering for the US from a military perspective. Therefore, the US should choose. Will it emphasize Europe or will it emphasize China? So if there were to be a change of regime or change of administration rather, I think that's the kind of question that you would start to see come up. But it's probably not one that would be answered by just emphasizing a long and slow and steady process of state investment to encourage American reindustrialization. It will probably be answered by one of the other two options: increased military emphasis on Asia or trade war. So somehow, I'm not sure that means there would probably be some change in emphasis toward China and away from Europe if there were a change of administration to the Republican side. And this represents in my opinion, represents a real narrowing of thought after the Trump era. When Trump came in, again, domestic deindustrialization was the issue. That's what people were upset about. Those were the people who suddenly came to the polls. There was an emphasis on realigning Republican politics around this. We're going to get more and more Republican interest on ways to foster reinvestment and manufacturing buildup and so on and so forth. And now almost all of that has been channeled into the great fear, which is the fear of China. And somehow that instinct just comes too naturally to the American right. I'm not sure exactly why it is. Maybe it's the primal experience of going through the deindustrialization process in the first place, going into Walmart and realizing that, or thinking that China is still producing, cheap plastic junk. Like there's no television broadcasting into the U.S. the fact that China is building, super high quality factories that use very advanced 5G technology to engage in automated manufacturing. Like the conditions for getting to a change in foreign policy in a productive way, I'm afraid, are not there.
So we have very little time left. Maybe let's talk a bit about, is there a hope for realism, a bit of return to the old world? Because we were talking about sovereignty, we were talking about how Ukraine is defending itself. It's a bit like the old world. Ukraine is not defending liberal democracy, it's defending its sovereignty. It's basically a war for survival. So do you think that it will bring back a bit of realism to our world?
Can I say something about the American thing? I think that's a very important question. Just to say, as a Brit criticising American foreign policy, everything I would say about the Americans, the Brits are even worse at. We just don't have the power to make it so important in the world. But I think there is a problem of a lack of realism. There's a problem of a lack of realpolitik. There's a kind of diplomatic, geopolitical illiteracy amongst the elites in the West. That they don't know how to do foreign policy anymore. They don't know how to do diplomacy anymore. The convergence of kind of using foreign policy as a platform for domestic political stunts. I mentioned Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan and stirring up a hornet's nest just to try and get a few votes in midterms. President Biden's foreign policy often seems to be trying to extend the kind of domestic culture wars around the world. This kind of soft cultural colonialism where he wants to paint the whole world in kind of rainbow flags as a sign of America's cultural superiority. You see that in Hungary with an ambassador that comes in and starts putting up posters criticising the Hungarian government as if that was anything to do with the American embassy. So I think there's almost like, it's not even ideology, it's like student politics. It's like a kind of childish student politics of protest projected onto the international stage. That's a very dangerous thing, and I think bringing back some grown-up politics would be very important. I think the question of sovereignty, I hope, is really back on the agenda properly when we talk about Europe and the Ukrainian conflict. I think, I'm a British Brexiteer. I believe in national sovereignty. I don't believe in a European federal foreign policy. And I think the nations of Europe have got to gird up their loins and take an independent path and be very careful about being sucked into other people's conflicts. In Hungary, more than anywhere, from the First World War, we know what can happen to nations when you get pulled into great power conflicts that aren't really in your interests, and the price you can pay for that. And so national sovereignty and independence, not only for Ukraine, but for all the nations of Europe, I think should be back on top of the agenda in the run-up to the European elections next year.
Dean?
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with our Brexiteer friend that I think we're going to see a decline in the power, let's say, or the influence of supranational organizations and bodies, because maybe in the West we liked them for a while. We had this dalliance. We really enjoyed the idea of banding together and forming what started as trade blocs and then became more political associations. And maybe this goes back to the desire to build empires, right? Include more people in our group. I have more guys in my gang. We can be you guys in your gang. But I think the countries that democratized in the third wave, which includes so many in Asia, for most of their histories, you have to remember, for most of their histories of these countries, they never had their own sovereignty before. They were either colonized or they were run by this or that. They didn't have suzerainty over to another state. So they're enjoying their sovereignty still. They're enjoying choosing their own leaders still. Whereas in Canada, I can't speak for the States, but in Canada, in parts of Western Europe, I think there's this apathy about democracy. I see a lot of headlines. Is democracy dying? Do we even need it anymore? Is it relevant? Is democracy relevant? Things like this are defeatism. Whereas you have this vibrancy in Asia about democracy and about classical liberalism. It's still because it's still new to them. And I tend to think that maybe the countries of Central and Eastern Europe are similar in that sense, that the idea of having a democracy is still relatively new and therefore valuable to us. compared to the way we're inured to it. We are happy to give away our freedom in exchange for a little bit more security, which is always the risk. It's always the thing to be wary of. So for example, when I first moved to Asia in the 90s, and as academics, journalists, were obsessed with the idea of regionalism. How will the regional project pan out? Will it be ASEAN? Will it be APEC? Which organization is going to become, the next EU of Asia? And of course, that never happened because there's no interest for it. There's no taste for it over there. Why, if you've just received your freedom, your sovereignty, the right to run your own country, would you immediately give it up for what? To be a bigger kid in a bigger gang? They don't want it. So it's something to watch. I'm not saying 100%, but it's something to watch, I believe.
I think the United States can afford to treat democracy as something for sloganeering more than to really work on, because it's actually so secure in the United States, recent problems notwithstanding. And there's something similar, in fact, about our foreign policy and realism. I think we're blessed in the United States, more so than Hungary, more so than people in most parts of the world, with the ability to be irresponsible in our foreign policy. We're blessed by geography and wealth, with the ability to be immune from the consequences of our bad foreign policy decisions most of the time. And therein lies, I think, the triumph of these, to me, unfortunate ideologies that dominate foreign policy discourse in the United States, this sort of crusading ideologies of liberal hegemony or neoconservatism or something like that. We can get away with it. We don't have to be that serious about it. We can sort of celebrate our genius and suffer the odd lost war, but not really suffer the way ancient states did when they made terrible foreign policy decisions and the earth was salted in the towns they used to live in. So to answer your question, I think that the odds for realism because of our good fortune in the United States are low. That being said, I think we could get better. We could get more realistic. We could learn a little bit from our errors recently, and some of the scarcity that might be occurring in our economy might have a ironically good effect on our ability to make smarter foreign policy decisions. So I think certainly as the policy director of an organization that promotes realism, all hope is not lost. I do think things could get a little better. And I do want to say, if I don't get another chance to speak, that I really appreciate the willpower of the people sitting here in front of me for being here in the heat and listening to this rather academic discussion when there's beer, like right over there. So thank you guys for listening to us and everyone else who can hear me, but particularly you guys up here. Thanks.
So glad in a final word on realism.
But let's break down realism a little bit, since it is this horrible academic term, and just say that countries have military interests and economic interests and cultural interests, and those don't always map onto the same set of alliances. I think now is the story that is starting to happen. First in Europe as a whole. The United States has been the main provider of military security, but it's not the only trading partner of Europe. That's a situation that I'm not sure that the U.S. has fully acknowledged when it has these debates about encouraging decoupling from China. It's very difficult for that to happen. At the same time, sometimes we're seeing now the U.S. try to compete with China on different planes, like China comes in with investment and the United States comes in with cultural propaganda or something like that. So these different elements of power are what is driving, what always drives foreign policy decisions and countries' awareness of their interests. We've got the military element, the economic element, and the cultural element, and those seem less and less to be going together. There are a lot of countries that have good trading relationships with a variety of partners and need military dependence upon the United States. But American power isn't like these three elements of American power that were aligned during in the era immediately after the Cold War, where America could be your primary military partner, your primary economic partner, and you're kind of part of the American cultural world too. Each of those things is still very powerful, but they don't go together in the same way anymore. And more countries, maybe they don't know quite how to navigate the resulting situation, but it is a situation in which more and more countries are necessarily trying to understand their interests and figure out how they will navigate that emerging multipolar world.
Well, the sky is still blue. Let's hope it stays that way, and not only for this festival, but for the whole region. And I think we had a great talk, and please join me in thanking the panelists for coming to Hungary and for enlightening us.